Today I wanted to talk to you about post-closing occupancy agreements, which are also sometimes referred to as a rent back. And a post-closing occupancy agreement is relevant for you whether you are a buyer or a seller. In both cases, it can be relevant in your life. Now, a post-closing occupancy agreement has to do with when a seller continues to live in the house after it has been sold. So the seller is no longer a homeowner, the buyer owns it, but the seller is now living in there as a renter and the buyer is now the landlord. And this can come up for a variety of situations, but it's important to understand what might be required of you so you're not surprised at the 11th hour. Now, the purchase offer, the contract for going under contract on the home, and the post-closing occupancy agreement are two separate contracts. Ideally, they would be written at the same time as you go under contract on a home, but usually it happens, the post-closing occupancy agreement happens after you've gone under contract. But in the purchase offer itself, there are several places that mention the existence of the post-closing occupancy agreement. And most importantly, although not all the details are hashed out in the purchase offer itself, a few key details should really be in there. And your real estate agent can make sure that all of this information is in there, but usually in the additional provisions section, there's going to be a mention of a post-closing occupancy agreement, and there's going to be some information about how long is the seller allowed to live in there, and whether or not they're paying rent during that time, and if so, how much the rent will be. Then, hopefully, shortly after going under contract, both of the agents, they communicate, work together to represent their parties to get this agreement put into place. And the reason why you want to do it early on is sometimes it falls off of people's radar and they get surprised at the 11th hour that, oh my goodness, I have to make a security deposit, I have to pay renter's insurance. You know, people just aren't happy about that kind of surprise, especially if there hasn't been a lot of goodwill throughout the transaction. So that's why you really want to front end this work when the excitement is high, people have gone under contract, they're at the point where they're probably still trusting each other. It's time to hash out those details as quickly as possible. So what might be required of you as a buyer or seller? Well, in the purchase agreement, of course, it's going to say how long the seller is allowed to live in the home, and it'll also say what the rent amount might be. What's also going to be described in there is who's paying utilities, who's paying water, who's paying sewer, who's paying trash, electricity, natural gas. There's a variety of things that need to be paid for, and that needs to be very clearly spelled out in that agreement. Another important thing is renter's insurance. So even though the seller no longer owns the home, the renter, the agreement might say that the seller is now a renter and they need to get a renter's insurance policy. If you're a seller, this is usually pretty easy because you just go and tell your current homeowner's insurance company, hey, I'm going to be a renter for a little bit of time. Can you just change this and make sure I'm covered? Now, I would really recommend to both parties to make sure that the seller has homeowner's insurance. If something comes up, it can just save people a lot of heartache. So I highly recommend that in that agreement, you make sure that the seller has a renter's insurance policy in place. Another thing that might come up is whether or not there's going to be a security deposit. So in the post-closing occupancy agreement, you can stipulate, is there a security deposit? How much is it? Who's going to hold on to it? And how many days after, once the buyer takes possession, is that policy going to be returned to the seller? And also there's an area for additional language where you might spell out, are the buyer and seller going to do a final walkthrough? Or right after closing, is there going to be a home checklist so that both the buyer and seller can agree in writing, this is what the home looks like, and then when the seller moves out, they can reference that list to make sure that nothing has changed. Now, in that agreement, as we just mentioned, those are some of the things that are negotiable, but there's also some areas that are non-negotiable. For instance, the buyer needs to have a homeowner's insurance policy in place as soon as they become the owner of that home. There's also going to be information such as the seller needs to maintain the home, they need to maintain the lawn, they need to keep it in a certain level of condition as they first found it. If you want additional information, I have a link to a blog post below that will give you further information on what to expect in this agreement, and I'll also give you on that blog post a link to the contract itself so you can start to take a look at that. So I hope this is helpful to give you an overview of what a post-closing occupancy agreement is about and why it's super important to get those details hashed out as quickly as possible. Thanks for watching. Good luck with the